So we have consent from OG and CO, no consent from OO, consent from government member, and maybe consent from government whip. I made a note of this. I'm trying to remember this before your speech. Remind us.
It's not like this is recorded.
Oh, then yeah, I can
Right.
undo it.
Consent for potential retraction later.
Yeah.
Right. Can I confirm that that's all? Yeah. Fantastic. Rules are as normal. Speaking times for 7 minutes. POIs are allowed and encouraged between 1 and 6. You will hear a bell that sounds like this. That's not loud enough. At 1, 6, and twice at 7, but please do try your own speeches as well. Are there any questions before we begin? The motion reads, this House believes that Narendra Modi's tenure as Prime Minister has done more harm than good for India. I welcome up the Prime Minister.
Cool. Everyone good? The key to Modi's rise to power is Hindu nationalism, and we think India would have been better off without it. What is the counterfactual? In the absence of Modi's rise to power, we think one of two things would have happened. One, the Congress party would have retained power because the reason Manmohan Singh was pushed out was because of a corruption scandal that was not endemic to the Congress party. If that was not the case, we think the likely counterfactual is maybe the BJP would have gained power, but in the 1990s and the 2000s, BJP's primary focus was economic neoliberalism. They probably would have still retained that policy, but Modi's specific contribution is that Modi's background is that he came from RSS, which is a pro-Hindu hate group, and most of his admin comes from that group as well. What he contributed is he fused economic neoliberalism with the cultural nationalism that Modi brought forward, which means that the economic neoliberalism probably still would have remained, but the cultural aspect would not have been there anymore. The TLDR is, there still would have been focus on economic growth. The meaningful difference and key contribution of Modi is a focus on cultural nationalism. We think that is the thing in the round. The first argument from opening government is we think that there's going to be there were severe impacts on economic policy as a result of this. And I know that opening opposition is going to come up here and talk about how India grew so much as a result of Modi. We disagree, and we think these are things that would have happened for 3 reasons. One, the growth rate in India One, US relations would have happened anyway, i.e. the fact that there's higher connections to the United States oftentimes is driven not by India's growth specifically, but the fact that China's growth was happening, which necessarily means that India's trade relations with the United States and being able to cozy up to the United States still would have happened. Secondly, historically speaking, in the 70s and 80s, India was a more socialist country, and as a result of that, there was a crisis in 1991 where the IMF came in and had to bail out the economy, which necessarily meant that there had to be policies that are instituted to make sure that there are more neoliberal policies. What does this mean for the round? All of the policies that they will claim have brought economic growth to India would have happened anyway. The second thing I want to note there then is what specifically is Modi doing differently in terms of economic policy. The first thing to note is in terms of where the resources are going. Because of the fact that he relies on cultural nationalism, he does not send resources to South India where there's a majority Muslim population, but oftentimes it's also poor. That means that most of the resources and infrastructure cannot go to these areas, and that means that you do not get development in these areas. People are suffering because of the fact that he relies on cultural nationalism. Secondly, the fact that relationship with Pakistan is worsening necessarily means that there are blocks of countries that probably will not trade with India anymore, i.e. the fact that there's more tension means that one, the risk factor is going up, which means that investors don't want to invest anymore. But secondly, and more importantly, it also means that a lot of Arab nations, for example, are less willing to trade with India because they are oppressive of Muslim minorities. What does all of this mean for the round? One, we think there's some uniqueness factor here, i.e. the fact that there is diminishing marginal utility, i.e. a dollar that goes to a poor person is a lot more impactful than a dollar that goes to a rich person, means that development in South India or areas that have fewer resources ought be prioritized. Secondly, and more importantly though, we think there's some uniqueness factor. That is, like neoliberal economic policies probably would have happened on either side of the house. The meaningful difference is, how is India capable of getting its edge? And the way in which you do that is by making sure that you have a diverse group of nations that you are capable of trading with. Modi has locked India up in a position where they are incapable of doing that. And as a result of this, India cannot grow economically as much as they possibly would have. That means that economically speaking, India would have been better off without Modi. Closing.
Okay, so you agree that growth is happening, but structurally it's not happening because no one wants to trade with India and so on. So where is it happening?
Wait, I don't think that's the argument. The argument is growth would have happened under our side. There are some elements of growth that cannot happen under your side of the house because of the fact that Modi is the one distributing resources. I don't think you understood the argument. The second thing I want to talk about then is I want to talk about the amount of ethnic tension that is created as a result of Modi's rule in India. The first thing I want to note here is that because Modi's rise to power depends on extremists, that is, they were the tipping point that gave him the election and allow him to retain power, a lot of the kinds of rhetoric that he supports oftentimes is exclusive of Muslim minorities. Let me give you a couple of empirical examples. For example, he instituted a citizenship law, the CAA Act, which allowed all refugees to gain citizenship except Muslims. And here, all might be like, but people already hated Muslims. But I don't think that's I think that's a little bit disingenuous. I think laws do shape political norms and how people interact with each other and how we view and treat the individuals around them, especially if you're forbidden by law and told that you cannot do hate crimes, that you cannot discriminate. And that's why empirically, we see that in India, there's a rise of hate crimes. Muslims don't feel safe on the streets anymore. Individuals feel threatened because of the fact that their government cannot protect them. Obviously, the world is not perfect under our side. Nonetheless, we think that the fact that the government is willing to take a stance at the very least and say, we do not discriminate, we abide by the constitution that says that India is a secular state, means that at least people feel safer under our side. And I know I know that this may not necessarily feel as relevant to individuals, but nonetheless, we think that the impact of it on an individual life who feels threatened, who is hate crimed on, that is a huge impact that they cannot deal with under their side. The second thing to note here is that Modi's power also relies on being able to authoritarian backsliding. The reason for this is that in order for him to preserve his power, he needs to make sure that his ideology is the one that persists. And that means that he does things like lock up journalists, kicking individuals out of universities because of the fact that they are criticizing Modi. How does all of this materialize? This necessarily means that at the end of the day, one, this is bad for India because it's bad for international relations that India has. Lots of European nations are skeptical of India's ability to continue as a democracy. Similarly, Biden and the Democrats in America are skeptical of India's positions. This also means that there are economic impacts that I've talked about earlier on, i.e. individuals are far less willing to do trade deals. But more importantly, it's just bad for democracy. We think democracy is important in the sense that it allows individuals to express their preferences. It allows individuals to say what they think is valuable and live in nations that they think is valuable. You do not get that under their side. Alt may say that people are going to buy into this narrative on either side of the house. But I think that at the end of the day, when there are explicit laws that discourage you and ban you from committing hate crimes, that's when you do change individual behavior. And presumably this is not perfect, but people do change over time. People move past the kinds of hate that they have over time. On our side, that is possible. On opposition, they are going to continue and lock India up in a state of cultural nationalism. We're very proud to stand on opening government.
I welcome up the Deputy Prime Minister.
Everyone ready? Countries and societies around the world and throughout history have made the deal with the devil that opening opposition is advocated for time and time again. And the historical record says it is never worth it. And even if it is worth it for some people, the price that is paid in blood, the price that is paid in people who live in poverty intergenerationally, the price that is paid in the psychic toll that it puts on people who don't feel safe voting, who don't feel safe going outside, who are told racial slurs when they are in the street, it is never worth it and it is never acceptable. Modi should not have been in charge. I want to talk about why democracy is so important and just magnify the impact of democratic backsliding that was thoroughly undercovered by the leader of opposition, even though it is clearly the most important issue in this debate. 3 concrete changes that I see happening in India right now. The first one is freedom of the press is under assault. People feel afraid to criticize the government. There are high-profile cases of journalists, of politicians, of people in academia coming out and criticizing the government, even modestly on technocratic details and getting fired or disappearing. Ashoka University, one of the top universities in India, had a major scandal over this. The Hindustan Times all of a sudden does not seem to want to be criticizing his government. Corporate concentration of the Indian media has dramatically increased, and people are not able to change this right now because they fear that the right-wing government, which has to pander to extremists, because remember, the key thing about Modi is he fused economic neoliberalism with Hindu nationalism. His government is full of these RSS crazy people, and they have a veto over anything he does. People are afraid that these people will come for you and they will put you away, and that means that it is very hard to get good information about what the government is doing. Secondly, people feel scared to participate in politics. Look, I want to be factual here. I don't think that the Modi government is going and personally killing Muslims in the streets. However, people look to Modi and say it is more acceptable for us to oppress Muslims in the streets because the government tacitly is on our side. There were pogroms in Delhi where people were killed door to door. When people went out and protest, there were people who were shot by members of paramilitary groups like RSS. And Modi government came out and said, we condemn violence on all sides. They were afraid to mention that the driver of the violence were Hindutva nationalist people who believe that Muslims have no place in Indian society, even though the Constitution of India says, the founding principle of the country says it's a secular democracy. Third and finally, the RSS, this group that started out as kind of like a large-scale social organization in India, people participated in it as a part of a social club, they did sports, they did language classes, etc., has become a major political force, and this is shaping the future of the country. Today, if you're a child growing up in India and you're raised Hindu, you're very likely to be enrolled in RSS language classes or participate in RSS extracurricular programs, but that wasn't true 10 or 20 years ago. This is starting to become viewed as like kind of the civil service equivalent of India that leads you into a path in government, and that was not true before. As this group becomes more of a political force, it means that young people in India are being socialized into believing this ideology of Hindu nationalism. Right now, this might not seem that concerning, but 10, 20, 30 years ahead, you have to ask yourself, where does this take us? Look at Israel right now. The people who are in charge are far right, and they are committing what might be a genocide if you ask South Africa. But the government in charge is not the most right wing. Their leading alternative is on their right, and people who are younger in Israel poll even more in favor of the war in Gaza than the people who are in charge right now. It is the old people in Israel who are actually on the left. The same dynamic is playing out in India right now, where the youth are being socialized into believing that Muslims are the threat, and these people need to be removed. We have to be expansive about what the impact of this could be 20, 30 years down the line. The last time that we had an authoritarian India government under Indira Gandhi, there were mass sterilizations. Protesters were gunned down in the streets. There were human rights abuses en masse. There are people who believe that she is a genocidaire, and even if they're wrong, she certainly is a war criminal. And the capacity for this to happen in the future is substantial when we're talking about a democracy that's been around for less than a century. I don't think we can understate the impact of this, right? What do we actually want as a society? No debater has an objective claim to that. We need democracy. We need a check on the system in order for us to ensure that the things that we want are the things that we get. GDP is not a perfect metric of whether or not we are living in a just society. Only people can choose that. For example, people in America may be wealthier than ever today, but they are deeply unhappy and depressed. The only way that we can ensure that people in India now and in the future are able to live meaningful lives is to give them control over the system that is supposed to serve them. They are damning that on their side. Let's deal with the economics. They gave you a couple of points. They said the Congress Party was dynastic. Absolutely false. India has pretty good democratic institutions in a pre-Modi world. The first thing is there's a ton of competition within the Congress Party. This is the same party that gave you Manmohan Singh, who's an Oxford-trained central banker who believes in neoliberal economics. He's one of my guys. And Indira Gandhi, who's kind of like a right-wing almost and wants to go and sterilize the population. There's a lot of competition between the Congress Party, and because India is not a first-past-the-post system, i.e. the party who is in charge does not just get to lock out everybody else. It also means there's a lot of smaller parties that can have influence on the Congress Party. So India has a huge amount of regionalism. There are areas like Kerala that are controlled by the communists. There are areas like Rajasthan that have more kind of centrist governments. And the median vote in the Indian Congress is what determines who wins. That is, even if the minority of the Congress Party wanted something, if they could get the other small parties to work with them, they could still get that through. So it actually doesn't matter what party you're part of. It matters where the median opinion in India is, which is why there was such a dramatic sea change in Indian regulation and legislation, even before Modi came into power. I'll take you. Closing.
You're painting a picture of India that is bloody on the brink of civil war, with your own characterization of intense competition within the INC, and then many different votes about different things flies in the face of this characterization.
So what I'm saying is that Modi has given a voice to an extreme faction, and the laws that they are passing are shaping opinion in India. The fact that you control the executive branch means you have a lot of power to shape the way people view the future of the country. When you are cracking down on press freedoms, when you are passing laws that says everybody except Muslims get citizenship, when you are denying people access to the best job opportunities, when you're not building infrastructure in those areas, it is shaping the way the future generations view the country. Political attitudes in India have moved substantially to the right since he came in power a few years ago. Additional point on this, insofar as India was locked in contractually into economic reforms. Remember, we told you they had a crisis in the 90s. The IMF said you only get money if you start neoliberalizing. India experienced the second largest poverty reduction in human history after China in the 90s, not in the 2000s. Under Manmohan Singh, his predecessor, their growth rate on average was higher than the growth rate that India has been getting under Modi. He's just more flashy about it because the level has risen, right? Obviously, you get richer over time, so your political influence as a country rises over time, but that was the trajectory they were always on. What were the unique changes that we told you? A, they're substantially less likely to invest in areas that are poor or underserved because they have larger concentrations of Muslims. B, uncertainty has increased dramatically, which means the type of investment and growth we get has qualitatively changed. India has more investment than ever today. Its stock markets are booming, but foreign direct investment, which is a subset of investment that goes into long-term capital projects, things like hospitals, things like trains, things like roads, has fallen over the last few years. People are speculating more because they expect it to be good in the short term, but they're not sure about the long term because its status as a democracy is under threat. Don't make a deal with the devil. We're very proud to propose the motion.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for that speech. We are now for convene again.
From now, I can just leave it on, correct?
I welcome up Member of Government.
I want to be very clear about the comparative in this debate, because top half almost seemed like world where Modi never existed as an individual versus what the obvious comparative is, where the point of divergence in the motion is him becoming prime minister. Thus, the likely counterfactual is him remaining in opposition instead, and crucially probably like narrowly losing and things like this, given that the rise of voter base behind him. I want to point out why this is entirely problematic for top half, because OG on the idea of Hindu nationalism and the rise of the RSS within the BJP never actually specifically analyzed why Modi as one individual was necessary for that party to rise. It's actually in the DPM they say it was an important voter base within the party, and thus renders their case somewhat non-comparative, right? If Modi hadn't been the person there at all, it wouldn't have happened. But crucially, he would have just been in opposition. It wouldn't have mattered if that happened. So that's a more reasonable thing, because even in your conception of the alternative side, it's got a little messy, is the idea that if like the BJP was in power anyway, but without Modi, your case also doesn't work. But on our side, we just avoid the issues anyway. Just wanted to point that out. Secondly, and this is I think where it's incredibly problematic for OO, because the very first thing OO tell you is all that growth you heard about that the INC started to implement was because the rise of Modi was pressuring them. In doing so, they conceived the power of strong opposition and the idea that Modi would have been able to enforce policy from the position of opposition leader. In this situation, like you said the sentence, well, your first partner did, but crucially then, what happens then is in this scenario, is that we are able to say how we get the same good policy in many instances, but what we're going to do is talk about what the problem is with the same policy being implemented broadly by someone different. And the idea here is that there's large apathy with the corruption cronyism of the INC. Like, it was played down a little bit because of competition internally, but like there was just huge headlines about this. Like, you can minimize it in framing, sure, but like it's a thing. Like, we all know it. In this scenario, then, what happens when Modi comes in, having critiqued the idea of corruption and does it himself, posed himself as the savior, and proved himself to be the same as any other politician? It is hugely disastrous to the long-term democratic patterns of voting within India, and we're going to weigh that above all else. The context here is that he did position himself as the savior. This idea that I can get rid of the corruption that is endemic within the INC, and was focused on critique to say they are giving money to themselves rather than to you, right? This has meant that when coming into power, he has gotten rid of some corruption, yes. However, he has still done a lot of it himself, because crucially, in terms of cronyism, he has given so much money specifically to the state where he is voted by some of Uttar Pradesh, whereas in the past, perhaps the INC has neglected somewhat, but he has overly favored it. It's in the same way doing cronyism. They talk about the cronyism going to big cities. Now it's just all going to the north where his biggest voter bases are. But secondly, on consolidation, he put friends in key positions of power, whether that be putting very close allies on the Supreme Court or just trying to stack administrative positions across levels of administration and bureaucracy. What does this mean? It means that he comes in saying he's the savior, and then he very optically does the exact same thing which he was critiquing. The politicians are lying to you. Before I get into the impacts of all of that, I want to know the inline impact of the Supreme Court thing, right? And this is literally just that, like, you put people on the Supreme Court, like, so if you want to do like structural mechs, in case people don't know, if that's not a headline story, because it's very unclear which specific policies are known or not. It's like 9 years, terms end a lot, often, usually like every 4 years and stuff. So he's able to put someone on. In this scenario, then, there's literally headlines that you do know, definitely, about gay marriage not being legalized, of it being voted down. And when you stack the Supreme Court, even before we talk about all the later stuff, the idea that the institutions are inherently stacked against progression and change is something which means you will never be able to get it. But more deep than that is that idea that you're never going to get people agitating for progression and change in this future that we're in. Because on apathy, when you have become in this situation where this was the voice which got rid of apathy, which was the voice which said you can believe in an India without corruption, and then was as equally corrupt, or at least very, very corrupt, you have this scenario then where who are you to trust? Both the BJP and INC are shit fucking options. And what happens there is people just don't trust politicians. What's the point in voting? Right? What's the point in going out and demanding change if the politicians are going to do it anyway? This is far better than even the freedom of the press stuff. Because no matter what, even if press freedoms aren't there, you may still have seen things in your own life. You may know that there are problems happening in your own life. But if you just don't care because you know, like if you care but you know that your vote is pointless, the information you have doesn't matter. So the idea of freedom of press is also itself contingent on itself then being willing to vote on that. And this is far more important because you have some information no matter what. But the second broad thing then, and that just means, right, that like India is just going to be locked into a position of political stagnation, of an idea that many people are not voting and demanding new change, and that's obviously highly problematic to fix any problems which either INC or BJP does. The counterfactual then is him being in strong opposition, calling out corruption, and as a strong opposition leader with a genuine threat, as the LO concedes at the top of their speech, forces the INC to reduce corruption to an extent. And then crucially, you start to see the effect of voting for people and pushing it further and further, and corruption reduce over time, and thus you can be hopeful about the future. Max, sure.
I'm Modi in opposition. I need to get people's attention. Do I criticize a lack of digital tax payments, or do I use virulent racism?
No, so what you could do is criticize corruption and say part of what we need to avoid corruption is the idea of cash payments to politicians. So you should have things like modernization. Also, credit cards have existed for a while, but like banking apps haven't, by the way. Like, come on, like, be charitable. But in this situation, then, what secondly happens? B, regionalization, because crucially when he's being cronyist, because when then the national government, the INC and the BJP are not a good answer anywhere, you are far more likely to turn to regional governments within your own specific state. And in this instance then, you just have political deadlock and also people not being able to work together. Because the BJP or INC are not in power at the national level and at regional level, they can't easily work together to enact policies in different ways. Like, sure, extra census information is really crucial, but also being able to work hand in hand with regional local governments as a national government is incredibly important in being able to do anything in the first place. And when you have regionalization, you then have a specialization of different policies all over your country, which then means what is the solution to people eventually start voting again? How are your economic structure is going to be when you have such a massive diversity of different economic systems and different political beliefs all across the state when you have further regionalization. But the last thing I want to talk about is the north-south divide, because the cronyism of the INC touched all, but the cronyism of Modi goes to the north exclusively. There's already a huge predisposition towards north-south divides due to issues of colorism, due to different faith structures, such as literally different forms of caste systems within even Hindu belief, but also separately, there's entirely different histories, being part of different empires and these kinds of things. What happens now then is when that cronyism is going all towards the north, you know that no one up north is going to give the south money, and you have even further less reluctance to ever work with the government. When it wants to do a policy, you have the census data, but if the people won't go to you when you want to give them things, or because they don't trust you, then you don't get it. At the end of the day, if there are bad things that happen on either side, we want voters to believe that they can fix it, and especially on the long term, that wins this debate.
I thank the member of government for that speech, and I'd like to ask our opposition member here.
I don't have photo. That's on me.
Everyone ready? I love a good example war. I'm a well-tested soldier in example wars. We are not going to fight the example war. We're going to talk about what is structural in this debate, and it's the mandate that the government would have had on either side of this debate, the mandate that a government under the Congress or INC would have had with the BJP in opposition. And broadly, we agree with closing government's conception of the debate, which is that we must engage with the counterfactual in a different way from opening government. We don't agree with their repackaging of opening government's impacts. So the first thing that I want to talk about is why a strong mandate was important to address issues. Because I do think that there's a certain generic amount of pressure that would have existed on governments on both sides to solve some of the issues that we're talking about. The problem with opening opposition here is that they do correctly and accurately point to a variety of empirical things that Modi has done to help India. They talk about biometrics, they, maybe talk about sanitation, all kinds of stuff. The problem is, if you actually look at their case, their analysis about why Modi was able to do this, and either Congress or the BJP can't, was that we know this is Modi because it's not written in the manifesto. It's him. His label's on The Economist calls it that. There's a bit more, right? But fundamentally, it is really unclear. Like, I mean, when you write a party manifesto, presumably you don't also write in what you would do in like 2041 into the future. So what's not clear is what made Modi unique. And as government points out, there actually are a large amount of things that do make Modi unique in bad ways, like Gujarat race riots, all his Hindu nationalism, etc. So it's not abundantly clear what he was uniquely doing on their side of the house. What seems better and more important are the constraints that are imposed on Modi when he's in power, and specifically the way in which they are better than a government where Modi is in opposition under a weak mandate government. The first thing I want to point out before I get into this claim is that, oh, that's weird. The first thing I want to point out is that opening government gives a variety of good reasons why India's institutions are bending, maybe breaking in some cases. And I'd suggest there are a variety of reasons why it's more of a bend than a break. Yes, the Supreme Court has been disempowered compared to before. Modi has been able to make appointments. But ultimately, it's a Supreme Court full of many legal scholars trained in the UK who have morals and have norms. No, they did not go after the citizenship law, no, but they've been blocking minor laws across states, and they have institutional power in the sense that they can make criticisms, they can have normative power. Media, yes, media is afraid in India, but it's a massive and vibrant media market. I'd suggest that more journalists are afraid than they were before, but nonetheless, there is a free media that does mount criticisms of the government. The larger problem is that people simply aren't receptive. Even prior to Modi coming into power, years of Congress in office didn't make people just mad on a corruption level, but also continued to activate Hindu nationalism in the background because these attitudes were simply being pushed out of government. And the effect that it likely has when we talk about the governments that government side gets is that we see what happens in France, where a centrist government comes to power, but is captured by the need to appeal to the right wing, a need to shift policy on the margin to take Congress away, which was At first, yes, a secular party, but nonetheless one whose voting base is primarily made up of Hindus in any case. So it is not clear that a Congress party, which opening government themselves says has to be propped up by minor regional parties in their world, is a party that actually overcomes the tendencies towards bad policy, either to implement many of the same citizenship laws or rhetoric towards Muslims, probably less. But more relevantly, it's not true that they get all the same economic benefits of opening government. The reason why is that the only way to resist the pull of protectionism, to help farmers, to help manufacturers avoid competition with China, to help farmers keep prices high, is to have a strong mandate. When a government is weak, when they face a BJP in opposition, when in the Congress party they've got all kinds of concessions to make, to regional parties in one province, to manufacturers to raise tariffs, they must begin implementing worse policy. They can't remain neoliberal. They're not locked in neoliberal. Countries default on IMF loans all the time. People come into power and they reject the IMF's legitimacy. The reality is that even if the BJP and Congress had neoliberal norms, for Congress to keep power in a world where Modi still would have existed, he was the head of a province in 2002. Uttar Pradesh would have still been controlled probably by the BJP in either world. There would have been a need to make bad types of concessions and have poor governance. I think this also just means gridlock. That is, it's hard to pass stuff in parliament. There are changing political coalitions. Small parties pull out of various coalitions. And that means as a consequence that if there's some level of power on political power on both sides to improve sanitation in rural areas or implement tough to do policies like digitization, when those can't be top priorities because parties are worried about losing their mandates in parliament and consistently shifting deals, it's pragmatically harder to implement the stuff that we probably get a degree of on both sides of the House. Now, I'm going to deal with closing government in a second before I go on. Yes.
New opposition come in the future in India. How do they rise up under Modi's rule?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there is opposition in India right now. The BJP has just lost several by-elections. They're likely to reduce their vote count to about 40% in Uttar Pradesh in the next election. There is an opposition. The fact is Modi is powerful. He has a mandate, but his mandate is more so on, like, I guess my point is they're institutions. They're worse institutions than they were before. I make that concession. There is political opposition. It is less powerful than it was before, but a combination of media that exists that is worse than before, a Supreme Court that has less power than before, but some level of power, norms of the Constitution, and the fact that probably the majority of Indian people are not at the moment hateful nationalists, and the fact that hateful nationalism is not a super comparative claim. Yes, the BJP has academies. Yes, the RSS has become more powerful, but Modi is a charismatic guy. The reason he came to power is that there are unique things that are appealing about him, unique ways that he can raise money from businessmen to fund the RSS on either side of the House, prime minister or not. So I do think that there are mechanisms of accountability. They're imperfect ones, but they do exist. And I think that just the fact that we prove this slightly better than opening opposition matters, because if I believe they're empirics, that there are certain good policies, I can accept that Modi does this now. That doesn't respond to the challenge that things get bad in the future. But the trend that opening government has to show is why institutions get broadly destroyed, or at least very significantly undermined, when we point out that there are ways in which they're very sticky and difficult to completely undermine over time. There are norms that are ingrained. There is the rhetorical power of the Constitution. There's the history of the Congress party. The fact is winning elections in the majority of provinces as by-elections right now, meaning that there are constraints that function. So what outcomes do we get on our side of the House? I think that a Modi who has to operate as an international leader does face constraints compared to the kinds of rhetoric he can do as opposition. If he had begun losing a bunch of elections, he does on some level begin to change the trade-off between virulent racism versus electability, because it becomes clear he has to have an even narrower political coalition without winning elections in the counterfactual world. But also as an international leader, he does have to deal with Muslim political leaders. He does have to concern himself with the security situation in Pakistan. So as compared to the type of stuff that he'd be saying in opposition that can activate racism, as opening government says, there are constraints from being an actual prime minister that happen, in addition to the constraints that come from opposition, from the Congress and from the Supreme Court. So I think the end takeaway is this. No, the BJP is not perfect. It does help us to access a lot of economic growth to have a stable government. The burden on government side wasn't just to show that we could have had a government, a BJP government without Modi, or a Congress government. So we had a good and stable government that wasn't dealing with fractionalization, with weak mandates. A government that could do things. Nationalism exists on both sides, but the capacity to do all the stuff on OO relies on political stability, and it relies on there being some constraints. We prove that and therefore win. Very proud to oppose.
I think the member of opposition for that speech that I like to talk about nothing. Yeah. We're the only two people old enough in the room to know what that fucking means. So thank you nonetheless.
I apologize in my Irish accent. Every word I'm going to say is going to be pronounced incredibly incorrectly, and I'm just flagging that in the beginning, and also to the stream. If anyone's watching this, don't pronounce anything the way I pronounce it. Okay. Ready? OG say democracy good, Modi backsliding bad. We agree. However, they don't necessarily say why democratic institutions would have thrived on our side of the debate. I think Jack fills a lot of those gaps in. But secondly, and most importantly, our opening don't talk about apathy. They don't talk about how the average Indian person engages with their government on both sides of the debate, and how a lot of the changes that we want to see happening going forward for India, as we acknowledge in top half of this debate, India is only within its first centenary as a country. There is a lot more that can happen in terms of developing those institutions and how the future people of India will be able to engage. I think the harm that Modi has done, and the reason it is more harm than good, it is massively either held back or in absence of somebody proving me wrong, destroyed the ability for the population of India to engage with democracy, and not just votes, but actual institutions of democracy that allow the poorest populations of India to find a way where they get policy that helps them to have hope that they can actually keep fighting for representation that resolves a lot of the issues that we talk about. I want to be very clear on opening opposition in this debate. I think opening opposition did a lot of good things to say, look, some good stuff happened under Modi, and then goes to list a lot of things that they call Modinomics, but ultimately are things that lots of countries around the world do. Lots of countries around the world have a national insurance card that has a number that gives people welfare. Lots of countries around the world acknowledged that knowing where poverty exists or knowing where wealth exists is somewhat helpful. Lots of countries around the world understood that new apps were being developed that were quite helpful. Lots of countries around the world understand that terrorists on your border, not so great for national security. Lots of countries around the world understand that fighting gangs and fighting crime was good. And I think honestly, like, how much we don't like the predecessors of Modi, I think equally they would have acknowledged that a lot of these things would be good. I think dynastic governments are able to understand that the best way for them to maintain their dynasty is to look around the world and see what other countries are doing to keep the poor somewhat happy and willing to accept their dynasty continuing. Meaning, I think a lot of those things would have happened. It wouldn't have been called Modinomics, it would have just been called economics. And that would have been absolutely fine. They say that oh no, these governments were happy to engage with the United States and thus wouldn't have bought the cheap oil from Russia. I think that's just absolutely absurd. I think a dynastic government would also have realized, Jesus Christ, the EU are being a bit stupid and not buying up that cheap oil. Maybe we'll buy up that cheap oil and get some economic benefit from it. I don't actually think Modi is an economic exception. Lucy Murphy can understand that. And I don't really have that many, genuinely, I might just be the old person, but it seems pretty intuitive. If there's really cheap oil and you have like 1 billion people and you can get access to it, and the EU aren't buying it up anymore, and the EU aren't raising the prices as much, because we did raise the price on India because we could afford to buy it at a bit more expensive than India could. Like, that's just fucking intuitive sense. I think a dynastic government that is looking to continue its dynasty would have done things like that. I'm sorry, Abhinav, it's just silly logic. No, thank you. Right? I think a couple more things on Modinomics are just quite true. Why else? Right? First of all, these things were just literally happening around the world, and I don't think opening. No, I don't think opening. I'm going to keep doing this for a while. It's going to be the same thing for a while. I don't think that a dynastic government would have not done this. But secondarily, and this is where the extension is helpful to this assault of basically, is the fact that Modi, still in our counterfactual, would have been strong opposition. Why then is, under our characterization of this debate, the dynastic government able to listen to the last 3 minutes of my speech and understand that might have made sense? No. With Modi being able to point out even if Abhinav is correct, or even if the POI from Max was correct, which is Modi in opposition would have been more nationalistic, would have been more populistic, would have been more racist, etc. The fear the dynastic government might have had of that strong opposition being the tipping point and winning the election against them is when they give small amounts more welfare to the poor, is when they do things like we'll reduce the gangs by letting you have access to these apps, is when they go, okay, we don't love Muslims, but we will stop certain amount of terrorism on the borders that is hurting hurting the border populations that often are the most disenfranchised because they are the most regional. It seems largely odd to me that the dynastic government wouldn't have done some of these things. Max?
Congress is in power, and it relies on small regional parties for votes that vary. It wants to do economics, it cares about economics, but little regional parties don't care about
Yeah,
economics.
this is your fractionalism stuff. I'll get on to you now. Do I have anything else on opening opposition? No, thank you. Oh yeah, and then the last thing on this is just ultimately the counterfactual and the knowledge that India was still a relatively new state. Liberalism happens over time. India has always been a caste system that had wealthy enough people that were able to go to institutions like Oxford, LSE, all these like insert like universities around the world. You were able to liberalize over time. You would have been able to, on both sides on our side of this debate, increase access to social welfare. Because note, the millennial group were becoming of political age on our side of this. They equally would have been able to push for liberalization. The POI I gave to Max, which is what is the next opposition party going to look like? He wasn't able to answer it. And the reason for that is Modi has killed the ability for people in India to not be apathetic towards politics. He has made it that the most impoverished Indians have just accepted their lot in life, that democracy has continuously failed us, that corruption exists in a different form no matter who we give for. He has killed that, and that was our extension. The last thing I want to deal with is the fractionalism stuff that comes to there. Fractionalism is best dealt with when policies are implemented that allow people to see support in your party. Meaning a lot of the stuff I do in the first 3 minutes of my debate speech deals a lot with that, right? I think we agree with CO that the problem is people weren't receptive. That is years no, it's like nearly 7 minutes. That is years of people not getting what they want. You deal with fractionalism in closing opposition in the same way you deal with opening opposition. You put in policies that give enough voters what they need, and that looks like a lot of the well-explained stuff that Abhinav did, but I don't think Abhinav is a political genius. I don't think Modi was an economic genius. I think ultimately these were common sense things that would have happened on both sides. The only specific thing in this debate is the apathy that Palmer proved.
I thank the government for that speech, and I would now like to welcome opposition vote.
Okay, I have so much to get through. Okay.
You can start with
What Max brings to you is a very clear picture of the Indian political landscape with Modi in charge and with Modi as a leader. What he tells you is that the counterfactual is a fragmented INC in power, weakened by a firebrand Modi that is armed with the same charisma and populist appeal as he has now. On the other hand, what we have in the status quo is a BJP that is powerful, that is popular, that is secure, a Modi who is moderated, has worse impulses by the fact that he has to be presentable as a world leader everywhere, and comfortable and therefore able to bring about his vision for India with sweeping and necessary reform that you wouldn't expect in the biggest democracy in the world. Let me explain to you why this is enough to beat 00. Because the first biggest thing we give to you is a vertical extension, i.e. we explain to you why we get digitalization, but also why we get the sanitation reforms that save so many lives across rural India, why we've been able to reform women, why we've been able to decrease tariffs and bring farmers into check. Crucially, what we have done is not just bolstered the burden that 00 has done reasonably well on, which is to observe things that India has done that is pretty good, but more importantly, to fill in the gap that they struggle on, which is why these reforms would not have happened in the counterfactual. And the reason for this is the INC would have been consumed with the need to cobble together coalitions to do things like avoid offending farmers, for example, to avoid doing things that are controversial and difficult and expensive, but also because the competition between political leaders and an INC that don't have a kind of personality means that the pace of policy passing or about democracy generally just so much slower, which is what you would expect from a country as large and as diverse as the biggest democracy in the world. This weighs against this material is strictly better than the other standard material we get from 00 about corruption and about how you are able to avoid war with Pakistan, just because I'm not sure how credible these threats fundamentally are. Because, like, look, India's institutions are pretty strong, but also because it's just not a credible threat that in the absence of Modi that you would have gone to war with Pakistan. There are like very clear reasons why any leader would want to avoid this. I think that they don't spend nearly enough time to prove such a high impact burden. Therefore, we give you access to 00's best material and the cleanest impacts in the round. Let me now weigh this against the material coming from GovBench. First, the CG material about democratic backsliding. So my ref to here is twofold. The first thing is what they tell us that like Modi had this whole career as an anti-corruption campaigner, and that when he entered power and betrayed all these promises, it was really, really bad for democracy because it broke people's faith that any leader could create change, and that as an opposition party that he is able to criticize and therefore reduce corruption. Two responses. The first is this problem does not exist because this is the biggest democracy in the world. Voter turnout is very, very high. Modi loses elections all the time. And the main other thing is like their only mechanism for this backsliding is that people become disappointed because Modi's let them down and therefore they're disillusioned. Okay, these are just words. I could also say equally, these people will just end up campaigning harder. Like there's like the reason why the number of people who try harder is larger than the people who give up is because there is an opposition party on our side as well who says Modi is letting you down. That this is my background. Come vote for me. Come turn out, and that this creates huge changes as well. Crucially, like their mechanism only applies to people who believed in Modi in the first place, literally Modi's voter base. But these are also the people who have the strongest incentive to cater to as well, who either hide the corruption from or does other things to distract them and say, we've done really, really well as well. Like there are literal cases that Modi ends up alienating Modi's own voters and therefore democracy collapses. Like this is an incoherent extension. But the other thing is that this is like a temporary thing at best. Like people come pissed off right now. Indians said we'll be fine in the long term. This is very, very poorly impacted. CG out. Okay, OG, before that, do you want to defend yourselves?
Like, you don't actually engage with the mechanisms we bring, and it's not that it's Modi voters.
Okay, cool.
That's not.
Yes, OG?
It is uniquely the prime minister who has the power to lock up journalists, strip the citizenship of Muslims, and give a blank check to hate groups.
Wonderful. Fear not. Now on to you guys. First extension is that your accusations of Hindu nationalism are vastly exaggerated. The first thing is like the counterfactual, as Max says, is that Modi is not dead, nor has he vanished into the ether. He's just way, way worse when he's opposition leader. One, because when you're not checked as a PM, because you get fucking shit or your legitimacy goes down when you say wild things to of random leaders, then you're way, way, way more aggressive about your rhetoric. But more importantly, because right now, Modi doesn't need Hindu nationalism to get re-elected. He has empowered the prime minister. He is responsible for bringing back enormous economic reform that can point to and be like, vote for me now. On the other hand, when he's opposition leader, he's a very strong incentive to be like, the status quo is untenable. And who does it blame it on? He blames on scapegoats. He blames on the Muslims. And he says, now there's a clean imperative to lock them up. They're responsible for the decline of our nation. For those structural reasons, they're way, way, way worse on their side. But number two, I also think that they just exaggerated the projection of what the future is going to look like. They've said Modi is pretty bad right now in 2045. Therefore, you must have full-out race war and genocide. Like, that is not the case, because there is a threshold to how extreme you can get. One, because I think the majority of people, even if they're willing to let things slide, if he tolerates things as leaders, for example, get a whole lot more pissed off if he starts inciting violence, for example, which on the other hand is what happens on our side. But number two, also because I just think that at some point Modi leaves office, I don't think that their projection is just something that is going to happen inevitably into the future. But number two, they are very, very weak on the counterfactual. They spent, I think, 2 minutes across both speeches on why the comparative is better. And this is mostly just pretty illustration by cobbling together a bunch of names about how the counterfactual is like neoliberal, technocratic INC officials who bring about a new economic dawn to India. This is not true. The reason for this is because the INC is able to be pure, able to be technocratic right now because it is not in charge. And because the number of people who care about technocracy and who give a fuck about an Oxford degree is very small in India, which is by far populated by people who live in rural areas, for example, a large proportion of the population is illiterate, and that's the demographic that Modi is appealing to. If the INC is in power, it has to appeal to these voters as well, which means it necessarily compromises on all the ideals that they think they're going to be able to bring about in terms of change. So, for example, you do things such as starting kowtow to the voters. You do things such as end up giving in and refusing to obey some of the IMF reforms. All of those reasons are why their benefits are something that cannot happen the moment that Modi leaves power. I think I've gotten through the majority of my material pretty quickly. Am I missing anything? I genuinely think that that's the majority of the OG material and the majority of the siege material. Max was really good. Thanks everyone.
I thank the opposition for that speech. They have one final round for all of the speakers. I presume we'll stop the stream so we can deliberate. Speakers and audience, please pack your and the room. Speakers cross the floor.